Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for having me. That was super informative and very helpful to understand the context that you're thinking about, and really touches on a lot of similar themes that I had outlined to talk about. And it really goes back to this idea of what happens when you create a culture that really values education, and suddenly you build more and more colleges and more students go to college. Then at some point you have to stop and think, how did the system get designed this way, and what was it designed for then, and is that design still relevant for how we think about education today? So let me take a step back and talk a little bit about UnCollege and how UnCollege started, and what it and why it came to be. You probably have a preconceived idea of what UnCollege is based on the name. That's both one of the great and terrible things about it. It has changed a lot since it started, and when I initially left school in January of 2011, I had some very strong opinions about what the challenges with college were that I was experiencing, and so went on a crusade to try and change opinions and notions about why we valued education and why we taught in the way that we did. That was really informed by my own background as an unschooler. I left school when I was 12, and instead of going to middle school or high school, I taught myself and created a learning environment from the world around me. That was a great experience, and I was able to do things that I never would have been able to had I been in school. But the beliefs that I had when I was 19 and idealistic and leaving college have definitely changed after having built a program around the ideals of UnCollege. What started out as a book, Hacking Your Education, which Penguin published, which I did about 100 interviews, people who had followed their own paths and gotten to success in their careers without relying on formal education. That research turned into an educational experiential learning program that focused on teaching the skills that make you a better and more effective learner, rather than subject-level skills. So we focused explicitly on teaching things like how do you negotiate, communicate, how do you build good study skills, how do you give and get feedback, how do you work in teams, how do you build relationships with mentors, rather than saying we're going to teach English or math or history or any subject-specific skills, which has traditionally been how we've thought about teaching in colleges. You start with a major and go from there. So over the course of the last 4 years, that's been built from a program with 10 students. There's about 100 that'll go through it this year. It's built and changed a lot. What we originally envisioned as a college alternative has become a pre-college program to help students understand who they are and how they learn, so that when they go to college, they can make the most of that experience. And we've learned that parents and educators are really engaged in asking these questions because they're trying to figure out the same things. They've been asking the question of how do we make higher education more affordable and accessible for a long enough time, that they're really willing to take a step back and think about what other alternatives are for the first time in a very long time. So that's been exciting to see. A lot of the rhetoric that I've been involved in over the course of the last 7 years has been around skills mattering more than degrees, and I think for the first time we're starting to see why some of that is coming true, and I'll touch on a few specific examples of that later. But as we build a workforce that is more and more diverse and more decentralized, you can hire for much more specific skills rather than focusing on degrees in a way that's going to really meaningfully change how I think corporations, at the very least, it'll probably take governments a little bit longer, how they think about hiring and training a workforce. So I want to take a step back and think about what education is in the beginning. When you're born, there's no schools, there's no grades. As a baby, if you want to learn something, you have to try it. If you fail, you fall down, and recursively, as you try things again and again, you get a little bit better and more knowledgeable about what works and what doesn't. And over the course of time, school as we know it, that is to say, a primary, secondary, and tertiary system that has one teacher in front of a classroom, much like I'm doing right now, is a reasonably modern invention. I'm not going to spend a ton of time talking about its development. I think that everyone has seen Ken Robinson's TED Talk at this point and has heard the story about why we designed schools to make people good at following directions. But as to the previous speaker's point, we've moved beyond a time where that is applicant, whereas that is applicable and relevant. Moving from training someone to be a good manufacturer to training someone to be generative is a very hard thing to do, and lots of people are trying to do it. And overall, I'm optimistic that we're moving in the right direction. 7 years ago, when I started UnCollege, I was pretty pessimistic that the system wasn't going to be able to change. And I've been really pleasantly surprised to see just how open and receptive people are, that they really want to solve the right problems. It's just that universities and education systems are big and slow-moving, and actually getting those to change and steer the course in the right direction is really, really hard. So primary and tertiary schooling became standard in the late 1800s, and then someone realizes that, oh, as we develop the economy, we need more education, and that truism has, I think, guided more of the development of education over the course of the last century and a half than really anything else. I think somewhere in the 1950s, most countries or states have a story about a leader who built or really expanded their country's education system in California, where I'm from. That's Clark Kerr, who was the first head of the University of California system. And so we had these ideals, and there's a quote from Clark Kerr that I think really sums up how he went about building the University of California, which was, a university anywhere can aim no higher to be as British as possible for the sake of the undergraduates and as German as possible for the sake of the public at large, and as confused as possible for the preservation of the whole uneasy balance. So we had these different systems, a British and a German system, one research-based, one tutor-based. And as the economy began to develop, economists came back to that old rhetoric of, if you want to build the economy, develop your educational system. And so we built a bunch more universities to enroll students, to learn whatever seemed relevant at the time. But somewhere in that process, as we started building more universities, we got lazy. We started copying systems that were working. We said, oh, well, to scale this process, we just need to build a bigger lecture hall, without thinking about what goes into that, what we're actually training students to do when they're trained to sit down and listen to a lecture, rather than engage in a problem that they care about, or are asked to work on a project with other students, or the fact that learning in a synchronous environment might not work the same, because not everyone's going to learn the same things at the same speed. So I tell that story just to keep in mind sort of where we are in the global development of education. I think in the U.S. we've reached peak college enrollment. Over the last couple of years, enrollment in private colleges has actually started to decline, and I think that's one of the things that has really caused people to start to think cogently about what else might be out there and what the future looks like. Just yesterday, after I was speaking, I had someone come up and ask about starting an UnCollege in Korea. So you might be right that it's not so far off. Another statistic that I recently learned that I think is really telling in the global development of the story about where we are in education is that there are roughly 2.5 times the number of students enrolled in higher education in developing countries today compared to the year 2000. And that's a crazy, crazy number to think about. It's on the order of millions of students. And we've modeled in the developed world that the way to be successful is to build more colleges and teach higher skills, and everyone should get a bachelor's and then a master's and then a doctorate. And it's very unclear to me that that model is sustainable. And I think it's really good that we're engaging in a conversation now about how we can not repeat the mistakes of the past and hope that we can give people who are countries that are just building their university systems an opportunity to do it better than we did, rather than just try and repeat the process. So the strategy of getting more and more students to go to college, it works, and it works pretty well in the US up until about a decade ago. And then you have 2008, you have a big financial crisis, you have a bunch of recent college graduates struggling to find jobs, and the grumbling begins. You start seeing newspaper articles about college graduates moving back in with their parents, and people are starting to realize that in the rush to get everyone to go to college, we forgot a couple of things. We forgot an emphasis on quality, we forgot an emphasis on outcomes, and we forgot an emphasis on cost. And this doesn't look exactly the same all over the world, but it happens roughly at the same time in the US. In the US, it's really characterized by the rise of student debt and college becoming increasingly cost prohibitive. In Germany, it's characterized by the limitation of students not being able to go to school indefinitely any longer. In the UK, they introduced tuition fees for the first time. So all over the world, this trend of countries realizing that that getting everyone to go to college is not necessarily going to work. Let's fix this microphone. Is not going to work indefinitely occurs at roughly the same time. In India, it's big companies like Infosys deciding to build their own educational programs when public institutions can't keep up with demand. For me, what this looked like when I was in college, starting college in the fall of 2010, was dropping out, moving back to San Francisco, and spending a few years bad-mouthing colleges and universities, trying to get a conversation started around what the future looks like. I've learned a lot of things since I was a dumb 19-year-old, but we all did silly things when we were 19. But what strikes me is both how right and how wrong I was. I was definitely on the right side of history that something needed to change. I didn't figure out a panacea or exactly the right way to do it, but it's been really enlightening and rewarding to be able to engage in that conversation over the course of the last 7 years. When I first dropped out, people would send me such nasty emails saying that higher education was never broken, and people would believe it indefinitely, and that their jobs were so secure that they didn't need to worry. And it's been really interesting to see the tenor of that conversation change over the course of the last couple of years. I think it was probably in 2014 when that conversation really changed for the first time, and that was the first year in the US that there had been an enrollment drop in private colleges for the second year in a row. And there were a couple of mid-tier colleges and universities that actually shut down and closed their doors due to financial insolvency. And that was really a wake-up call, I think, for the educators to say, oh, if we don't provide an education that's relevant and of quality and is focused on outcomes, we are not going to be able to survive unless we're Yale or Harvard and have a $40 billion endowment. If I'm a regular college and the vast majority of students do not go to elite schools, the ones that you can name off the tip of your tongue, you are very much revenue dependent. You depend on the tuition coming in, and that means that you have to think really intelligently, but also cyclically every year about who's coming and who wants to enroll and what the outcomes look like. So no one really quite agrees on how to fix what's going on, but I want to share a couple of tidbits about a couple of different types of programs that are going on in the US that I hope that you can take and learn and implement here in Korea. I'd say the problem in the US has primarily been focused on cost, in that it has become very expensive. It's been secondarily focused on outcomes, having students not being able to get the jobs that they wanted, and third, being focused on the fact that there's really only one system and hasn't been multiple pathways. So the dream that I had when I was 19 of being able to create a one-year program that would replace college definitely never came to fruition. Building an education system is really hard, and I have much more respect and understanding for those who work in universities now than I did before. I think one of my biggest takeaways, though, is that we conflate someone's growth and development and maturity and try and educate them at the same time. And there's a lot that needs to go on between the ages of 18 to 22 to understand who you are and how you learn and how you navigate the world. And we also say, oh, and by the way, we're going to train you for jobs at the same time. And if I could make one change overnight, it would be to separate those two things and have time explicitly focused on the growth and development, and then time focused on preparing for jobs. I think what is true more than ever is that the meta skills, things like self-awareness and self-control, will serve you more today than they ever did before, and that it's of utmost importance to be able to learn how to do something new rather than have an arsenal of skills that can pull out of your back pocket. If the thing that you're best at is that you can do things that you've never done before really well, you're going to be a lot more adaptable and flexible than your peers who just followed a straight path and passed the test, but can only regurgitate the information that they learned. At a macro level, I think one of the things that's really interesting is that we're seeing the balance of power in terms of innovation shift away from places that it's traditionally been held. My friend Jeremy Kustenbaum, who works at the Institute for the Future, likes to refer to this distinction as high velocity versus low velocity economies, and describes that the next big innovations will come out of Lagos, Nigeria, or Shenzhen, rather than coming from Silicon Valley or Tel Aviv. And as you think about how to adapt to an economy that is increasingly high velocity, it's increasingly decentralized, that's unfamiliar to the rigor and structure that we have been trained to operate with, I want to offer a few suggestions for us back in the developed world as we sit here thinking about this as to what I do to keep up. There's a company in the US called Trilogy that partners with schools, elite schools, to develop modern web boot camps to train schools on campus, because the schools can't innovate their curriculum fast enough to be able to keep up with industries. There's a college called Minerva that has built a framework around different types of skills to assess, that they have open sourced everything that they do and published a book about the process. And if I'm a professor, I want to go and read that book as fast as I can to understand what the new skills and competencies are that make sense to assess and teach. If I'm leading a technical team, there's a company called Andela that does a really wonderful job of building bridges between remote team members in Africa and embedding them in full-time technical teams at the world's largest companies in New York. They have they've worked with the who's who of companies, and the concept of being able to bridge talent across those gaps, I think, is really powerful. There's a company called Degreed, and if I'm a learning and development manager who's thinking about how to train my workforce for a high-velocity environment, I want to empower my team to learn as quickly as they can and use a program like that. And if I'm thinking about who to hire, I want to use something like Roykoi to hire actual diverse talent, because only having diverse talent will steer my business in the right direction in a world where the sources of revenue are coming from more and more diverse places. It's easy to look back and I think be nostalgic and think about education as a place that we went. And one of the reasons that I think it's taken a longer time to move this conversation around education forward is that everyone has an opinion about education. Everyone went to college, or everyone went to university, everyone has a child. And so it can be really hard to take a step back and think independently when you have such strong opinions and biases. And it's easy to be nostalgic and look back and say, oh, the days that my dad went to UC Berkeley for $200 a semester, were just 50 years ago. And sometimes it feels like the world is falling down around us, but overall, like I said, I'm really optimistic that we're on the right track. Yeah, it's exciting to have seen the changes over the course of the last 7 years and see where they're going. So I want to sum up with a few last points, and then I will leave the stage. Universities are changing their pricing by major. There's a program called income share agreements that's launching in the US that is pricing programs by major so that students have a better idea of how much time it'll take to pay off their debt. More and more students are finding work on distributed work platforms like Upwork, and the traditional job as we know it is really changing. I don't want to get on the robots will take our jobs train, but there's definitely some truth to that. It's been really interesting to see the extent to which corporations are taking funding of education seriously, both developing their own internal corporate educational programs, but also committing funding to causes that matter. In the last month, we've seen Google commit to $50 million in CS funding, for example. And I think it's exciting to see corporations starting to take diversity seriously and realize that it actually really impacts the bottom line. Intel came out with a report at the beginning of this year that found that for every 1% increase in the diversity of their staff, there was a 3% increase in profit. So all in all, I'm optimistic about the way the world is heading, and I'm looking forward to the conversation. Thank you.